In this video, I want to do a quick, very short notes just to review some things in C++. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. One, this week you are dealing with functions. So I want to give you some quick facts regarding functions because it should be a review. You should have covered functions in a prior class. Just to give you a quick notes. Functions, there are two types of functions. You have your void and your value returning. Okay? Your void functions don't return any data back. Your value returning functions returns a data, some sort of data back. So you have two types of functions. So how do they look in syntax wise? So let's do a quick void sum function. That's what that will look like. A value returning function, well, that depends on what the data type of the data that's being returned is. So if this value returning function is returning an integer, then that's what the function looks like. If the value returning function is returning a string, then that's what the function, this is the syntax, looks like. If the function is returning a double, and that's what it will look like. So once again, there are two types of functions: a void function, value returning function. Now, functions can also have parameters, which go in the parentheses. Parameters are values needed by the function to do its task. So if void sum function needs some data prior to doing its task, then that's where parameters come in. So for example, now we have a function that is value returning because it's obviously returning something. And because it doesn't have the word void in front of it, it has an int. So it's a value returning function. And now notice, unlike the other examples that I have here, in this case, this function requires two values as parameters passed to it before this function can do its job. So for example, let's say this function adds up two numbers and returns the sum. Well, in order for this function to do its job, those two numbers it's going to be adding up needs to be passed to it as parameters. So that's what this part is. So here we need two integers passed to this function prior to this function doing its job, which is adding those two numbers up and returning the result. So that's kind of my quick cheat sheet, if you will, on functions in case you forgot it from last class. So there are two types of functions, void and value returning, and there are parameters you can pass to the functions before the functions can do its task. One last thing, parameters can be passed in by value or by reference. This is an example of parameters being passed in by value. What that means is these two numbers being passed to this function are being copied. So when the int main passes these two values to SUMADD function, the two values are copied over to SUMADD function to use. You can also pass parameters by reference, and this is what that will look like in syntax. This is an example of parameters being passed in by reference. What that means is instead of sending a copy of the data to this function, int main will be sending the actual data to this function. The difference between the two, if you're sending a copy of the data to the function any changes made to the data is not going to affect the actual data in int main. If you send the actual data to the function, any changes I make in the function to the data here will also affect the data in int main. So, quick summary on this cheat sheet. You have two types of functions, void and value returning. You pass parameters to functions prior to the functions doing its task. That's of course if it requires it. You can pass parameters by value, which is a copy being sent over, or by reference, which is the actual data being sent over. So that's a quick cheat sheet on functions in case you've forgotten. Let's do one. So here I'm going to do a very quick void print hello function and a very quick add function that requires two parameters passed into it to do its job. Now notice I'm doing the three-step process here. The first thing I'm going to do is list my function prototypes. These are function prototypes. It just lets the computer know that I'm going to have two functions in this project. Although as you can see, the two functions have not been defined yet. The definitions usually go outside of int main and usually goes underneath the bottom part here. And this is where I actually start defining what these functions do. So I'm actually going to keep this very simple. This function is going to basically do a printout of hello world. My other function that I declared up here as a function prototype is going to take the two parameters passed to it and add them up and return the result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and do return A plus B. So this A and this B is being added up and the result is being returned to whoever's making use of this function, which is in our case going to be int main. Alright, so I'm now ready to go ahead and use the two functions. So this was a function prototype. These were the function definitions. It's in int main when I actually use the functions is where I'm going to do my function calls. In order to call a void function, it's very simple. In int main, all you have to do is use the function's name. So you don't have to indicate the type. You don't have to say void. You don't have to say it's a value returning function. You just use the name of the function. So in my case, my void function is called print hello. Oops, excuse me. Very simple. All I did was call the function by its name that I gave it, open close parentheses, because that's what this function doesn't have any parameters, just empty list of parameters, semicolon. So at this point, int main has called print hello. And what that does is basically the computer is saying int main is calling print hello to do its task. And as you can see, print hello's task is basically to output hello world. Once I've done that, let me go ahead and make use of the other function that I have, which is the value returning one. So first, I'm going to go ahead and set up two variables, both integers, and I'm going to also actually initialize them to some values. So I have int num and num2. Num has the number 3 in it, num2 has the number 5 in it. So now I'm ready to use my function. Now that I have the data, I'm ready to use the function. So I can do this. I can declare a variable called sum, set it equal to the add function, and pass to it my num and my num2. So what is happening here is the local values 3 and 5 that's in int main is being passed to the function add. What that means is a copy of 3 and the copy of 5 is being sent to the add function, where add function is going to save the 3 in A, it's going to save the 5 in B, and it's going to go ahead and return 3 plus 5 in our case, and return the result. When a value is returned back by a value returning function, you need a place to put it. So notice I have declared a variable called sum, and sum is where I put it, if you will. Now, the variable that contains the value being returned, the type has to match the actual value being returned. So notice here, this function returns an integer. The variable I'm using to contain that value is an integer. So because the types match, this is going to work. So what this is doing is the function is being called with 3 and 5 passed to it by value. So a copy of it is being passed to add for add to do its job. The result is being returned back to int main, and for int main to keep track of the result, it's saving that in int sum. So sum is holding the result of the function call to the value returning function. So you'll notice there's a definite difference to calling a void function versus calling a value returning function. A void function, you just call it by name. And if it had parameters, I would have also passed the parameters in. In my case, I don't in this particular example. If you call a value returning function, you'll have to have some place to put the value being returned, and the types have to match as well. So add returns an integer, so I'm putting that result in sum. And then of course I can go ahead and just see out, 3 plus 5 is that, and then sum. And what that will do is that will print out, of course, 3 plus 5, which is, of course, in this case, add will return that, which is 8, right? So that's one way. So you can call a value returning function by setting it equal to a variable being set to that function. Another way you can call a value returning function is directly in the cout statement. Both these lines 21 and 23, are going to pretty much display the exact same thing, except in line 21 I have this sentence that displays as well. But this is going to display 8, and this is going to display 8. The reason is because here we're actually containing the value returned in a variable. Here we're not containing the value returned in any place. We're just kind of calling the function, and when the function returns that value back to int main, that value is being immediately displayed to the screen. So you can use a value returning function in those two ways. You can either have the value that the function is returning saved to a variable, or you can actually call a value returning function directly in a cout statement so that the value that's being returned back gets displayed right away. Calling a void function, as you can see, is still very simple, just the name and indicate that it's a function. Right, so here's that function call. This is also a function call, and this is also passing in parameters by value. This is also a function call. Function call within a cout statement. Right, so if I compile this, oops, sorry, I forgot my system pause. So you'll notice it only showed me for a split second. So I'm going to use my system pause so I can actually see it. There it goes. All right, so notice what I see on my screen. This is a compiled version of my program. The line 12 calls the function print hello. The function print hello outputs hello world. So you'll notice I see the words hello world. Right after that, I have some variables being initialized, the variable sum being set to the value returned by the function add, and then I have a cout statement. So that's the next thing I'm going to see. So notice I see 3 plus 5 is, and then the number 8, which makes sense. That's this line being shown. Then I have just cout and then calling the add function straight from the cout statement. You'll notice I just see the number 8, which makes complete sense. So those are the 3 lines I see on my screen. Again, I'm in the iLab environment, and then you see press any key to continue. That's my system pause. And this is just my quick notes on functions. All right, thank you.